Good morning. I've got 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get our webinar rolling. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and we are so very pleased this morning to have a webinar for you on land use tools for small towns and rural areas. The webinar is going to be presented by Wendy Phelps with some contribution from Andrew Shepler. Wendy is with Tool Design Group, and Andrew is with the Ohio Department of Transportation, where your LTAP Center here in Ohio is located. So before I turn things over to our presenters this morning, I'm going to go ahead and go over just a few housekeeping items. On your screen, and you definitely need a screen to have logged in to see the webinar and really get the full effect of the webinar, you should hopefully see a chat pod on the bottom left-hand corner. It says conversation at the top. If you don't, look for a circle that has a thought bubble in it and click on that, and that should display the conversation panel for you, which is also the chat pod. The reason I want you to have this on is because we do have everyone muted except for our presenters, and we would ask that you please ask questions during the presentation in that chat pod. I will be reading those off to Wendy and to Andrew as questions are put into the chat pod, and I have the opportunity within their presentation to read them to them. But that's definitely the way we would like for you to ask questions. At the very end, if we have time, we'll open the phone lines for questions as well. But please make good use of that chat pod. And also, I encourage you to work with Wendy and Andrew through the interactive tools that they have in the presentation. They do an excellent job using interactive tools during these presentations, and you're going to get the most out of this presentation this morning if you engage in that interactive tools. So anyway, with that, the only other thing I want to mention is that we are attempting to record the webinar. Don't let that dampen your enthusiasm for asking questions, though. We are glad you're here live because the recording doesn't always work. But if it does, I will definitely send a link out to the recording to everyone who was on the webinar. So with that, I think I've taken up enough of the hour. Wendy, are you ready to roll?
Yes, Victoria, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Victoria. I'm very grateful to be able to speak today, and we're grateful to ODOT for hosting this webinar, and I think this is such a great example of how state agencies can collaborate to meet their common goals in Ohio. This is our agenda for today's webinar. I'll start with a brief introduction. We'll go over some upcoming events. We'll do a brief recap of the first webinar that was held about a month ago, and then we'll really get into our topic for today. What is rural, and what are these land use tools that small towns and rural areas can take advantage of to see the kind of growth and development that they want to see. We'll have a few implementation examples, and then, as Victoria said, if we have time at the end, we can do some Q&A. You're also welcome to submit your questions throughout, and Victoria will be reading those to me as they come in. So I am Wendy Phelps. I am a project planner with Tool Design Group. I am one of 3 regional outreach coordinators who provide technical assistance related to active transportation under our contract with the Ohio Department of Health. Our team leads trainings, workshops, town halls, and develops resources for all of the Creating Healthy Communities coordinators in Ohio. As far as my public health experience is concerned, a lot of it is mostly personal. My work at Tool Design focuses a lot on safe routes to school, and we see a lot of programs really take off and gain broad support when they can make that public health connection between students' active travel to school and their physical and mental health. And I know from my own experience how much being able to walk and bike to work makes a difference in my own life. The services we provide through ODH are funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge their contribution and thank them for their ongoing support that makes our work possible. We have several upcoming events here. After today's webinar, we have our final 3rd webinar in the series on June 13th. It will focus on how to address land use related health problems in urban areas, and you'll be able to register for it on the LTAP webpage. These webinars really serve as a preview for some in-person workshops that we're hosting throughout the state. We're excited to be partnering with a bunch of MPOs to host these, Anyone is welcome to attend these, and I highly encourage you to find a community partner to bring with you to these workshops. These workshops will allow you to help build important cross-sector relationships between health and land use professionals. Our next one will be on June 19th in Dayton, and we're partnering with the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission. And then on July 23rd, Buckeye Hills is co-sponsoring a workshop in Marietta. The rest of the dates are being finalized now, and you'll be able to access those on the ODH website. Another resource I just wanted to remind you of is this Land Use and Health Best Practices Report that we've put together for the Creating Healthy Communities regions. It covers a lot of the content of Webinar 1 and has some great Ohio case studies that you can refer to. And this is available on the ODH website as well. It's time now for our first interactive poll. I'm curious to know how many people on the line attended the first Land Use 101 webinar on March 21st. To access the poll, you can go to www.menti.com and use the code 264540. I've got one person on the line who attended the webinar. Ooh, half and half. Give it another minute here.
Wendy, while those responses are coming in, for those who didn't attend the first webinar, I can include a link to the recording of that webinar when I send out, hopefully a link to this one as well afterwards.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all for participating. This is great. For those of you who participated in the first webinar, thank you for coming back. And for the majority of you who were not present at that webinar, thank you for joining us today, and I hope that you'll find lots of useful content in our presentation. All right. So why is land use important? The way that land use and transportation shape our built environment is inextricably linked to public health outcomes. Over the past decade or so, there's been an increasing acknowledgement of this fact and more emphasis on the links between transportation, land use, and health outcomes at the federal level and also at the state level, as we've seen in Ohio. More and more grant funding is focusing on the intersection of these two issues, and I think that's a particularly important thing for small towns and rural communities to be aware of. So now I'm just going to do a brief recap of some of the fundamentals from our first webinar. Definition of land use. Land use is the practice of how communities manage and modify their physical space. The main purpose is to ensure a community's economic, social, and environmental strength. It doesn't only regulate the built environment, it also can shape the natural environment, can be used to protect wildlife areas and wetlands, determine the location, type, and intensity of agricultural uses, and to reserve space for parks, trails, and other recreational uses. In Ohio, land use is the responsibility of village, township, city, or county governments. Decisions about land use are often made as part of an extensive public process with input from community members. This often occurs during a comprehensive planning process or comp plan update, which guide all aspects of a community's long-term change, and we'll be talking a little bit more about comprehensive plans later on. Land use policies can determine where different kinds of activities, such as living, working, recreating, best fit into a community. These policies can also regulate how buildings and sites should be laid out and configured. For example, a zoning code could require sidewalk-oriented building entrances to encourage pedestrian activity, rather than having entrances of buildings that face giant parking lots. On the flip side, zoning codes can also prohibit certain uses within zones which separate residences from jobs and services, increasing trip length and reducing the ability to walk or bike. This should give you an idea of the power of land use to shape our daily habits and preferences in how we interact with the built environment. Land use planning is a crucial opportunity for local governments to shape public health outcomes, which is one of the reasons that we're doing this series of webinars and workshops throughout the state. It shapes the way that people live, what forms of transportation are available to them, and the amenities that they can access. Planners love to use this graphic to illustrate all the different types of built environments that we live in. It's called the transect, and it's divided into separate zones that range from the urban centers on the right all the way out to the small town rural areas on the left. Today's webinar will be talking about the zones closer to the left, natural, rural, and to some extent suburban. While these zones have their differences, they also share some common challenges, especially as development spreads beyond urban areas. These are just some examples and descriptions of these different contexts. Oftentimes in urban cities, you'll have a gridded street network, a lot of destinations close together, which makes it easy to walk and bike and use transit. In suburban areas, things are a little bit more spread out. You often have a separation of uses dictated by the zoning codes. Makes it harder to walk and bike places, and there are often very high-speed, wide roadways that need to be crossed. In small town and rural areas, you can see some isolated developments, a lot of reliance on motor vehicles, and just different patterns of development that can make it hard to get around without a car. These different contexts obviously bring up different health issues in different areas. There's some overlap in certain categories, but there are also health challenges that are unique to certain types of communities. Particularly at the urban edge or suburban edge, greenfield development encroaching on farmland reduces the supply of locally available fresh food. The lack of proper sewer infrastructure can lead to contamination and of poorly planned and unregulated development can compromise the natural ability of water systems to remove pollutants. And then low-density single-family housing and auto-dependent lifestyles and long distances to centers of social activity can lead to isolation and mental health challenges. Land use can also affect environmental health. I think particularly in rural communities, allowing noxious land uses to locate near developed areas can cause major hazards to the community environmental health. Land use regulations can also have the less direct but equally adverse impact of requiring all trips to be made by car, which increases pollution and cuts down on physical activity. So to get a sense of who's on the call today, our next poll is about what type of community do you live in? So it's the same website again, and then the same code. All right. Looks like the numbers have evened out here. We've got a good mix. We've got about half the audience is in a small town or rural area, about a little over a third joining from an urban area, and 14% from a suburban location. So the next part of this presentation will kind of go in further into the definition of small town or rural. And I think that some of the things that we'll talk about today also apply to suburban jurisdictions, particularly ones that are growing and changing and maybe right next to a small town or rural area. Sorry, getting ahead of myself there. All right, so what is rural? From a land use and development perspective, rural America includes towns and small cities, as well as working lands, farms, prairies, forests, and rangelands. Historically, rural land has been primarily used for the production and extraction of resources. But as you can see on the images on this slide, not all rural areas sort of look or feel the same. In Ohio, there are vast differences between the farmland in the northwest portion of the state and the Appalachian region to the east and south. You also have small towns and rural areas very close to more developed areas. The concerns and goals of these different communities vary a lot, so there's no really one-size-fits-all strategy that encompasses all rural areas. So not only does rural look different when you're there, but it also can look very different on maps depending on which definition you use to define rural areas. Looking to the sort of federal government and national standards, the U.S. Census defines rural solely on population, so areas with less than 500 people per square mile and places with less than 2,500 people are considered rural by the census and are the gray areas in the map above. But different federal agencies define rural differently. The U.S. Department of Agriculture goes beyond the population definition to include economic relationships and labor flows. So this means if a certain percentage of a county or area is commuting to a different area, that's considered, they lump that together with the more developed area. So on the map below, you can see the urban areas in black, the rural areas that are part of that metro area in the red color, and then the rural areas that do not have a strong connection to an urban area are shown in gray. These definitions matter most for grant opportunities with these federal agencies, and much less so for today's webinar. So at a national scale, of the nation's 3,142 counties, almost 2/3 of them are classified as rural. By this definition, about 20% of the U.S. population lives in a rural area, and rural lands make up about 75% of the total land area. Then in Ohio, when we look at this map, the non-metro counties are shown in yellow, and metropolitan counties are in brick red. This is a very broad brush definition at the county level, so there are many areas, there may be areas of the metro counties that look and feel quite rural. Of Ohio's 88 counties, about half of them are considered fully rural. According to the Health Resources and Services Administration, 20% of Ohio's population lives in rural communities, and the USDA estimates classify about 81% of Ohio's land area as rural. Now that we have a few definitions for rural areas, I'd like to get your thoughts on what some of the challenges are related to health and land use in the communities that you work in. So we can go to our next poll. This one is open response. You can submit more than one response. Just make sure to hit submit when you're done. All right. Some of the challenges that we're getting in here include lack of public transportation, transportation for non-drivers, lack of people power in townships, the over-reliance on cars. Sounds like emergency services, provision of emergency services, access to resources. Scroll down here. Food desert, access to fresh food. Narrow right-of-ways that are difficult to accommodate active transportation. Great. Thank you all for these responses. Since everyone is pretty well versed in some of the challenges that you're dealing with, I won't spend too much time talking through these, but I do want to highlight maybe some key themes that you will recognize. One of the challenges in rural communities is the aging population. They have the same concerns. Elderly people have the same concerns about healthcare access as other rural residents. They may also face additional challenges related to transportation to medical appointments, grocery shopping, and other essential activities. Their housing quality and affordability may be a challenge. Challenges paying for needed repairs and modifications. And it may be difficult for elderly residents to age in place in rural communities. Rural areas in Ohio also have a higher percentage of the population with a disability, as well as chronic disease death rates. Active transportation is a proven way to reduce chronic disease rates, but if you live in a rural area with no safe or comfortable places to walk and bike, as submitted on that survey, you may have to rely on non-motorized travel. So this can be very isolating for people in rural communities. One of the reasons are contributing to some of these challenges are just the physical barriers in many rural communities. We have got hilly terrain, waterways, active rail lines, rural highways that can be difficult to cross. There are also challenges and hazards associated with productive lands, whether for resource extraction or agriculture, which can contribute to things like air, water, and noise pollution. Sort of some are influenced by the physical terrain and historical land use patterns in rural areas, low-density development, auto-oriented transportation networks, and the provision of public services are challenges for many small towns and rural areas. Low-density development patterns in rural areas mean that people have to travel further for work, school, and errands. In this example, it would take 1.5 hours to walk from Colegrove, a suburb of Ironton, to the nearest elementary school, and that's provided if there were actually facilities that would allow you to do that safely. With lower densities and greater distances, many rural areas have developed in a more auto-oriented fashion than urban areas. Prioritizing motorized vehicle travel comes at the expense of people trying to walk and bike, and then high posted speed limits and narrow shoulders often deter non-motorized users from accessing rural routes, even if the destination is nearby. Lastly, the provision of public services, roads, storm and wastewater, electricity, and broadband are all essential for the high quality of life in the 21st century. But when growth takes place kind of haphazardly or it isn't planned, it can be very difficult and expensive to provide these services. Lastly, another challenge more so in rural areas is the impact from productive lands. This is especially an issue in areas where residential development is occurring at the urban fringes. We'll look more closely at some of the tools for rural land use that can address this issue. But before we do that, it's time for our next poll. So what are the benefits or strengths of small towns and rural communities? Oops, looks like when I change the slides, we've got lack of funding and weak land use regulations. I think those were for the previous question, but now for benefits and strengths, what are some ideas? We're resilient. Very nice. Relationships, great. 2, sort of on the same theme there. Yep, close-knit communities. Easier to manage, small size of population. Partnerships, wonderful. All right, thank you so much for participating. We're going to shift back to the slides here. Thank you for your contributions. I think we are all on the same page here, as this is the first slide that I came up with and developed when I think about some of the rural communities that I've been able to work with in Ohio. They're very vibrant social places, strong social networks, a lot of small town pride, really creative ways to celebrate that pride. The examples on this slide include a colorful mural celebrating Nelsonville's historic brick industry, or this throw pillow that you can buy in downtown Millersburg, showing Millersburg right in the center of the map. Other strengths are the potential for tourism and recreation. Small towns and rural areas, or small towns often serve as gateways to recreational assets and have a strong tourism industry. Good land use practices can ensure these resources are protected from development and support a robust tourism economy. It's not just the natural environment either. Today there are many different cultural and historical routes through rural areas that are both educational and enjoyable, like a brew trail or a wine trail. Agritourism is also an emerging trend. Another strength of rural areas, as land in cities becomes more scarce and the cost of living goes up, individuals and businesses are often attracted to the edges in smaller communities where they can stretch their dollar further. When not managed properly, growth can contribute to longer commutes and social isolation, but when done strategically, these negative consequences can be minimized. Other rural strengths include environmental benefits, sort of on a macro scale, from food production to carbon sequestration and water quality protection. Rural areas are extremely important to the overall health of the region that they're in. And now that's kind of concluding our challenges and strengths of rural communities, and I think I wanted to start with those so that we could set up and kind of look at the big picture and talk about sort of what the goals for rural land use practices should be. The rural land use practices should sort of look towards these three goals to help guide them. The first one is preserving the rural landscape by creating an economic climate that enhances the viability of working lands and conserves natural lands. Another goal should be helping existing places thrive by taking care of assets and investments such as downtowns, main streets, existing infrastructure, and places that the community values. And the third goal is helping to create great new places, building vibrant, enduring neighborhoods and communities that people don't want to leave. These goals are from a resource developed by the International City and County Management Association titled Putting Smart Growth to Work in Rural Communities. I found it very helpful as I was putting together this presentation to refer back to this, and a link to it will be included at the end of the presentation. So this is kind of where we're headed today. We're going to talk about these different land use tools. On this slide, the broadest tool is the comprehensive plan on the left, and we'll get down into more detailed tools like design standards all the way to the right. And that sort of the reason that we want to talk about this today is that pretty much everyone on the line, I'm sure, can think of a change that's happened in their community in the last 10, 15, maybe even last 2 years. Some of the changes might be good, like getting a new grocery store where there wasn't one before, but other changes can be negative when you have sprawling development or the loss of an employer. Regardless, the changes are going to continue to happen in any type of community that you're in, and having the right land use tools in place will help manage change in a way that preserves and enhances the best aspects of the community. So as I mentioned, we'll look at comprehensive plans, land use planning, zoning, and design standards. And within the overarching topic of zoning, we'll also look at sort of several different tools under that umbrella that communities can employ. So a comprehensive plan is kind of what it sounds like. It takes into account a lot of different things and is a long-term plan that guides all aspects of the community's development for the next 20 or 30 years. It often includes a chapter on existing conditions and goals for housing, economic development, transportation, land use, public facilities, and the natural environment. Many times the comprehensive plan serves as a basis for zoning regulations. Comprehensive plans can be created at the village, township, or county level and are often developed through extensive public input. Input may be gathered in a variety of ways, including public meetings, planning charrettes, or through mail or online surveys. This is just one example from a county in Ohio, Knox County. This is their Comprehensive Plan 2018 update. The plan sort of raises and seeks to answer questions such as, where does Knox County desire future industrial, commercial, agricultural, and residential development? What kind of jobs the county should pursue or to be created or maintained in Knox County? What does Knox County want to be positioned in the next 20 years? And what can be done to best preserve their rural character and natural beauty? I think things to note about this plan is that financial assistance for the plan development was provided by AEP Ohio, the Community Foundation of Mount Vernon in Knox County, and the United Way of Knox County. The county hired consultants to help jumpstart the planning process by facilitating some goal-setting sessions and creating some of the maps that you see here on the screen. I think there are two valuable lessons to learn here. The first is that if local capacity is limited to create a comprehensive plan, there's help available from a variety of resources. And secondly, the steering committee was very strategic in their use of working with consultants. They used their consultants' expertise where it was most needed, sort of to help start the conversation and set the goals and then do some of the technical aspects that the committee couldn't handle themselves. But then they really relied on sort of their local knowledge and ability locally to complete some of the plan writing and other elements of the plan. Land use planning. So just like we saw on the previous slide in the Knox County example, almost all comprehensive plans include a land use map and discussion of existing and desired future land uses. The main goal of land use planning is to allocate land resources to meet the current needs of community while also safeguarding future resources. Land use planning is a crucial opportunity for governments to shape public health outcomes. It shapes the way that people live, what forms of transportation are available to them, and what amenities they can access. In addition to these behavioral factors, land use can also affect environmental health. Regulations that permit low-density development encourage travel by car, which increases exposure to pollution. Similarly, allowing noxious land uses such as landfills to locate near residential areas can cause major hazards. Within land use planning, we talk about subdivision, and I think that for most of us, the mental image of a subdivision looks like the picture on this slide, a lot of similar looking houses lined up on a cul-de-sac. But in land use planning, subdivision refers more specifically to the standards and process for dividing up large parcels of land. Subdivision regulations ensure adequate provision of access, streets, storm and wastewater facilities, utilities, and other critical infrastructure that is critical to the long-term health of development. Zoning is the next thing we're going to talk about. And zoning, as you can see on the slide here, regulates the intensity of a particular existing land use and carries the force of law. Land use planning broadly determines where different land uses will be located. Subdivision regulations determine the size and configuration of the parcels. And then zoning regulations specify the permitted and prohibited uses as well as the development density allowed. Zoning is the purview of local government and is used to protect the health, safety, and general welfare of the residents. And I think a fun fact for our audience here today is that the Supreme Court case that established the constitutionality of zoning originated in the village of Euclid, Ohio. Ambler Realty Company desired to build some industrial buildings on the property that it owned within the village of Euclid, but was prohibited by the village of Euclid's zoning ordinance. It was right next to a residential area, and the village did not want those industrial uses next to where people were living. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled in 1926 that zoning was a valid use of the local government's police power and had a rational basis. This case of Euclid v. Ambler also has influenced planning terminology. You may hear zoning referred to as Euclidean zoning, and this means that the zoning code strictly separates residential, commercial, and industrial uses. Fast forward now to the 21st century, and we can take a look at sort of some zoning regulations in Ohio. A 2003 study found that around 60% of Ohio townships use zoning to regulate their land use. Townships can adopt zoning through a majority vote by residents. This same study also looked at the reasons behind the decisions to adopt zoning, and found that citizen support was the #1 reason for a township to either adopt or not adopt their own zoning ordinance. This was followed by the growth pressure, locally undesirable land uses, support from the county level, and to promote economic development. All right, this brings us to our next poll. Does your community have zoning? So a little bit over the percentage that was found in that 2013 study, or 2003, study. We've got 8 of the 11 responses for yes, 1 no, and a couple not sures. Excellent. All right, so now we're going to get into some different types of zoning tools. that communities can use to help direct growth. The first tools I want to talk about are agricultural or conservation zoning districts. Both of these help achieve that first goal of rural land use planning, preserving the rural landscape by protecting agricultural land and open space. By prohibiting non-agricultural uses, you can help reduce complaints and keep farmland and vast swaths of habitat intact. Another related tool here are conservation easements, which are agreements between a property owner and a land trust or other organization in which the property owner receives tax benefits by agreeing to place restrictions on the use of their property. This is a tool that can be used to protect natural resources, a viewshed, or the rural character of an area. Another zoning tool is called transfer of development rights. This is a method for protecting one area of undeveloped land, which is also called sometimes the sending area, by transferring the rights to develop to another area, also known as the receiving area, usually in the form of density bonuses in that receiving area. Montgomery County, Maryland, where my office is located, has a really successful TDR program. The county is located just north of Washington, D.C., and has all of the development patterns that we saw on that slide back at the beginning of the presentation, with very urban areas close to the D.C. line that transition out through suburban and then rural areas to the north and the west of the county. Montgomery County has a long planning tradition, and the transfer of development rights is just one part of it. The program began in 1980 over a concern about sprawling suburban development that was consuming 3,500 acres a year of open space. But in conjunction with the agricultural zoning tool that we saw on the previous slide and with transfer of development rights, we now have more than 50,000 acres in Montgomery County are protected from development in an agricultural reserve. The next zoning tool I'd like to talk about are planned unit developments. They can help preserve open space, just like the previous tools, but really they're used to allow more flexibility in the types of uses that are permitted and then the design and layout of these communities. These can help meet goals 2 and 3, preserving existing places and creating great new places. And the image on this slide here, I'd like to kind of talk through what the difference is between a planned unit community and more traditional development regulations. So for example, under the traditional regulations, the 24 or so houses on this slide would likely be situated in the middle of very regular shaped rectangular lots, and they would be very spread out. With the planned unit development, developments can be clustered to save on infrastructure costs and preserve that open space at the top of the slide there. This also makes it easier to walk and bike to a neighbor's house, and similar principles can be applied to enable and encourage active transportation trips to school and daily errands. In small towns and more developed areas, historic preservation districts can be used to protect aesthetics of neighborhoods or downtowns without dictating allowed uses. So this is one of the tools that can help attain goal 2 of helping existing places thrive. Communities do not need zoning necessarily to create a historic district. Maintaining historic districts and encouraging a mix of use in compact walkable areas encourages active transportation and helps facilitate social connections. Historic districts also help promote local business ownership, since many chain retailers have specifications that are more easily met through new construction. Since communities don't necessarily need zoning to create a historic district, the way that a historic district is preserved is through a thorough review of any development applications. The review would look at the development's overall size, setbacks, architectural style, and proposed materials to help make sure that it was in keeping with the elements of the historic district. I think one thing that's great about sort of historic areas and many small towns is you have a real sense of place. And so the last tool that I'd like to talk about today really influences the details of the built environment that makes a place stand out and can help support goals 2 and 3 of rural land use, sustaining existing places and creating great new places. So there are 2 tools here on this slide, development standards and guidelines. The first, development standards, are requirements for the size, bulk, or siting that are specified within the zoning ordinance. Many local governments also have design standards for roadways, parking lots, storm and wastewater infrastructure. The standards must be met or exceeded for development proposals to be approved. So to the second tool, development guidelines, are a little bit different in that they're not regulatory. A really good example of design guidelines from Ohio is this Essence of Athens document. This document is not binding, but was created to summarize and communicate community design values. It is a celebration of everything that makes Athens, Athens, and includes design inspiration from the built and natural environment. It includes suggested materials, color palettes, as well as some designs for elements in the public right-of-way, like bike racks and benches. The document was created through a public process and effectively sets expectations for high-quality development in keeping with the community's aesthetic. And it's hoped that these design guidelines would influence both public projects, private projects, and the document itself, I really encourage you to check it out. It's highly graphic, easy to understand. A lot of land use is not easy to understand, but developing something like this for your community is something that I think everyone can take part in and really help strengthen sort of that community, the social cohesion and the strong communities that everyone highlighted as a strength of small towns and rural areas.
Wendy, I have a question that came in through the chat pod on the guidelines. It's from Toby, and they'd like to know, how can we balance historic preservation and design guidelines with affordability, especially for aging residents?
That is a really, really great question. I will have to think about that a little bit.
Toby will definitely get you an answer. Just have to give us a little bit here.
Yeah, thank you. I think that historic preservation, too, there can be, part of that review is making sure that things are in keeping with the look. They don't necessarily have to be the exact same materials, but you want it to all be sort of speaking the same language. I do think it's hard when you get into sort of retrofitting, maybe housing, to accommodate the older population, and adding things like ramps for access. But again, I think choosing the right materials for that can help everything sort of look cohesive while still being, functional and adaptive to changing needs. Are there any other questions that have come in?
Just one, and it's really more of a question about availability of this information. Amanda wanted to know if the PowerPoint slides would be sent after the webinar's over, and we will definitely be posting the PowerPoint slides online and emailing everybody a link. There was a comment in the chat pod from Michael Blau, who's also been involved with presenting in this webinar series. His comment is, ODH will be releasing a report this summer that covers zoning tools for maintaining housing affordability, upzoning, inclusionary zoning, etc. We also cover aging in place. So there's a great additional resource that'll be available.
Great, thank you so much. So we've covered a lot of ground up to this point in today's webinar, and I think, one, it's going to take a little while maybe to digest it, but two, you want to know sort of what you can do with this information and how you'll be able to use it. So before we wrap up today, I have a few suggestions I want to share about how you can be more involved in land use decisions at the local level. The first one is sort of starting at square one, doing your research. If you're not sure if your community has zoning, find out. Look into the comprehensive plan. When was it last updated? Find out who sits on the planning commission. When does it meet? Knowing the answers to these questions will help identify opportunities for public input, such as during a comprehensive plan update or development review. Sort of the next suggestion here is to, once you know who the people are to talk to in your community, start or continue to build your relationships with them. Show how land use tools can improve public health. Both public health and land use are data-driven fields, so using data can help legitimize your views and expertise. Land use and economic development are driven by money. I think frame your collaboration pitches to demonstrate cost savings and economic benefits of public health improvements. And I think when you do that, it's really important to think about projects, over their entire life cycle. Sure, it may cost less to develop on a parcel outside of the main town, but what are the external costs that you're passing on to citizens when you do that? Planners and health professionals both love acronyms, and make sure that you understand some of the jargon when you go into these conversations. The resources that ODH has developed can be very useful for this, like the one that Michael just mentioned about housing affordability. We also have a zoning FAQ sheet and the land use and health best practices report. Another great resource that you can return to is ODOT's regional transportation planning organizations. So now I'd like to turn it over to Andrew Shepler to speak a bit more about them and how they can help you.
Thank you, Wendy. And I think it's great that we had the interactive part of the presentation, because some of those challenges that were mentioned, like lack of active transportation, lack of transit, manpower issues, lack of funding, are things that the regional transportation planning organizations in Ohio can help with. Did the slides go away?
They sure did for some reason. Wendy, we need you to reshare, please, if you don't mind.
Okay, I can keep talking, but one of the key parts on the slide is going to be a map of where these regional transportation planning organizations are in Ohio.
There we go. It's back up now?
There it is. Okay,
there you go.
Awesome. And these organizations are regional planning organizations that have been trained and know all the different funding sources and have transportation data. So they are a great resource to reach out to. If you're in one of those regions, I highly recommend reaching out to them. I have a long website to tell you. So rather than doing that, I would say just Google Ohio RTPO, and the ODOT website will come up in the search box. And if you click on that, there will be a link to each RTPO's website on that page. And they can help you through different funding applications, different grant applications, and they will be happy to help the communities in your region. And then also from the challenges, active transportation, ODOT is just getting started with developing Ohio's first statewide bike and pedestrian plan, and there will be 2 stakeholder meetings coming up in rural regions of Ohio, and they will both be held in RTPO regions. One is in Cambridge on July 16th, and one is in Marietta on July 17th, and more information will be coming out soon about those meetings. So with that, I will turn it back over to Wendy.
Thank you, Andrew. I think definitely encourage you to check out their website. They have some interest. They have a newsletter they put out with some interesting case studies and different examples of the work that these organizations are doing in their communities.
Wendy, just so everybody knows, I did put a link to the RTPO website on ODOT's webpage in the chat pod.
Wonderful. Excellent. And then kind of to wrap up today, I wanted to give sort of a final suggestion of a way that we can become more involved in local land use decisions, and that is in the decision of where locations of community facilities are. Regardless of whether or not a community has a comprehensive plan or zoning in place, they send strong messages about their community goals and priorities through the way that public facilities are provided. These decisions should be made with the benefits and costs of the entire life cycle of the project in mind. And again, I want to kind of go back to what we talked about in the first webinar. We had 4 general principles of designing for health, which can help guide the discussions and influence your input when it comes to locating community facilities. As a reminder, these principles are designing to increase active transportation, designing for mental health, designing for children, and designing for environmental justice. Planning public facilities with these principles in mind help keep communities compact and less auto-dependent, which can decrease segregation by age, income, and race, and help develop social and cultural capital. Residents spend less time commuting to jobs and more time with family members. It also provides opportunity to walk to destinations and increase physical activity, decrease ailments associated with inactivity, improve air quality, and help decrease respiratory problems. Next, we're going to look at just a few examples. I know we've got about 10 minutes left here. And some of these examples are good, some of them are not so good, but I think they're all kind of illustrative of the sort of different challenges we have when we're looking at growth and changing communities. So the first one is the Marion YMCA. Their previous location was right downtown. It was really easily accessible for people to get there and spend time with their friends and attend fitness classes. When it was time for them to expand, they looked at different sites and eventually moved to a location about 3 miles outside of town, which is the red dot on the screen there. This one is much harder for a lot of people to access, and even people that live in the very close by neighborhoods have difficulty getting there without driving because of the gaps in the sidewalk network. One interesting result of this move that they've been able to track is that there's been an increased demand in their on-demand transit service for people wanting to access the YMCA. Before, they didn't need to use this service when it was located downtown, but now that it's a little bit further from town, many people are relying on this service to access the classes and maintain the social ties that they have there.
Wendy, we have a question that's come into the chat pod. It says it's from Jason, and he wants to know, are there guides for GIS and zoning applications?
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure.
Sure. Are there guides for GIS and zoning applications?
I am sure that there are. Are we talking about sort of the software or sort of best practices?
Yeah, Jason, well, you're not connected on the audio. Can you go ahead and put a little bit more explanation about your question in the chat pod? And Wendy will keep going with the presentation, and then we'll come back to, he says best practices.
Yeah, I am sure that there are, and maybe we can add some of those links to when you send out the slides and recordings.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to get that out to you. You're welcome, Jason. He said thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Another example is the Ohio University Proctorville campus. This one is located just outside of town, about a half a mile from sort of that main downtown area on the river there. It's half a mile is generally a very walkable or bikeable distance, but there are no sidewalks, bike lanes, or even wide shoulders on sort of this rural roadway. It doesn't actually have many connections to the neighborhood that it's in either. But we want to end on a positive note here, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Campbell's Market in McArthur. Smart land use planning and federal grants helped the market become the only grocery store with fresh produce in Vinton County. It opened in 2017. Before that, there had been several years where residents would have to drive 30 miles or more to access fresh food. The market is located just outside of downtown McArthur and is accessible via sidewalk on West Main Street. Vinton County residents are now able to access fresh food within a few minutes rather than having to drive more than an hour round trip, saving money on gas, reducing air pollution, and giving them more time with their families and other sort of leisure time activities. So there are really good examples of adaptive reuse. A lot of communities are taking what used to be schools and turning them into community centers, kind of maintaining that walkable neighborhood and providing a place for social connections. So there are many other good examples out there, but this is certainly something that I think, particularly for schools and other public facilities, that there's a public process involved in these, and it's important to speak up and make your voice heard and kind of help your community stick to whatever goals that they have set out and understand the benefits of building in areas that are more walkable and bikeable and help support public health. So So these are some links to some of the resources that I've mentioned today. You'll have access to these slides. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. And we have a little bit of time here for any additional questions.
Absolutely. And I think what I'd like to do is, if you are interested in asking a question, why don't you just, type in the chat pod and ask me to unmute you, and I'll go ahead and unmute you, and you can ask the audio question that way instead of me going through and unmuting everybody. And you also can just put the question directly in the chat pod. But I think this has been excellent information, Wendy, and we really appreciate the time that you guys took to put the presentation together and the partnership with Ohio Department of Health. This webinar series has just been wonderful for the transportation community.
Well, thank you very much. We're really glad to be able to present this information and look forward to working with ODOT and local jurisdictions to help further active transportation.
Great. Now, it doesn't appear that there's been any other questions come into the chat pod, and no one's asked me to unmute them. So I would say that we're probably at the end of our webinar for this morning. So thank you, everyone, for your participation, and thank you to our presenters. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.